They called her the quiet one. That's what the day shift nurses said when Katie Rodriguez pulled the night schedule 3 days a week, spoken with the kind of dismissal reserved for people who don't make enough noise to matter. 6 months at Mercy General in Houston, and she perfected the art of becoming furniture. 6 months of fluorescent hum and beeping monitors and the particular silence that falls over an emergency room at 2 in the morning. She didn't attend the staff happy hours. She didn't linger in break rooms. She signed in, moved through the ER like a current through water, helped where help was needed, and signed out without leaving a trace. They didn't know why. They didn't know that anonymity was a form of survival. Katie pushed through the double doors at 11:48 p.m. on a Tuesday in September, her scrubs already smelling faintly of antiseptic from the pre-shift ritual. The ER had that particular quality of quiet that only night shift possessed, not peaceful, exactly, but restrained. 3 patients in triage. 2 in beds. The trauma bay stood empty like a held breath. She clipped her badge to her collar with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything, and the laminate caught the harsh overhead light. Rodriguez, RN. That was all anyone needed to know. Her limp was barely noticeable anymore, only visible in the way she favored her right leg when exhaustion crept in after hour 6. She'd learned to time her bathroom breaks to hide it. The nurses' station sat at the hub of the ER like the bridge of a ship, and Katie moved past it with her eyes forward. Janet was charting something, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. Marcus was scrolling through his phone with the dead-eyed focus of someone on hour 12. Neither looked up. Katie logged into her workstation and pulled up the assignment sheet for the night. 3 patients in the stable block, 2 in observation. Her territory. Her rhythm. The way she'd arranged things since she'd arrived at Mercy General in March with a nursing license, a reference letter so vague it barely qualified as a sentence, and a 7-year gap in her employment history that nobody had questioned hard enough to matter. She moved to Bedford to check on Mrs. Chen, 73, post-appendectomy, stable. Katie's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the foresight, confirming the saline drip rate, noting the catheter with the kind of attention that made the monitors feel like extensions of her own senses. Pain was information. Pain was data. She'd learned that in places she didn't think about anymore. Mrs. Chen opened her eyes, recognized Katie from earlier in the shift. "How's the pain, on a scale of 1 to 10? 3. Maybe 4. Katie nodded, made a note, adjusted the drip slightly. No fuss. No unnecessary words. In and out in 90 seconds. By the time she left, Mrs. Chen was already drifting back to sleep. The ER maintained its quiet stillness until 2:34 a.m. That's when the siren started, distant, then closer, that particular wail that meant something serious was coming. Katie was restocking the crash cart when the radio crackled to life, and she heard the paramedic's voice cut through the static like a knife through silk. Trauma alert, ETA for minutes. Male, appears late 40s, unresponsive, multiple lacerations to face and torso, significant blood loss, no identification on scene, found in alley behind the warehouse district on Richmond Avenue. The ER came alive the way it always did, Marcus moving toward the trauma bay, nurses appearing from corners like they'd been waiting for permission to exist. Katie finished the last of the syringes and moved toward the bay without being asked. This was the part of night shift that made sense. This was the part where the rhythm took over. The ambulance doors opened at 2:38 a.m., and they rolled the stretcher in with the kind of controlled urgency that meant bleeding and time pressure. The man on it looked like he'd been through a fire. His face was battered, not recently. Katie's assessment came automatic. Some of these bruises were hours old, and there was a deep laceration across his right shoulder that was still seeping blood despite the bandaging. His clothes were torn and filthy, the kind of wear that came from concrete and desperation. No wallet. No phone. No way to know who he was or where he'd come from or whether anyone was looking for him. Vitals? Katie was already moving parallel to the stretcher, her hands already assessing. BP 92/60 and dropping, heart rate 116, respiratory rate 28, the paramedic said, his voice clipped and professional. We've got 2 large ball lines, running normal saline wide open. He took a blow to the head, probable concussion at minimum. We found him about 40 minutes ago. They moved into the trauma bay, and Katie positioned herself at his left arm as the team transferred him to the ER bed. Marcus was already cutting away the remaining fabric of his shirt, and she could see the full extent of the damage now: lacerations, contusions, an abdomen that was distended in a way that suggested internal bleeding. But it was his hand that made her stop. Just for a moment. Just long enough that anyone watching would have noticed. Just long enough that her breath caught in a place she'd learned to keep locked. His left hand lay palm up on the sheet, and on his ring finger, scratched and tarnished but unmistakable, was an Army Ranger ring. Solid gold, the crest worn but visible, the Ranger tab, the crossed muskets, the year engraved on the inside. She'd know that ring anywhere. She'd seen it on 50 different hands. She'd worn the equivalent on her own neck for 12 years. Her fingers moved to the torn fabric of his jacket, still bunched at his waist, and she eased it open. Inside the lining, almost invisible, was a patch. Faded. Stitched with careful precision into the fabric itself, the kind of thing someone did when they wanted to carry a memory they couldn't lose. The patch showed the number 75, and beneath it, the words Ranger Regiment. Her hands were moving on their own now, her body remembering how to function in crisis even as her mind was catching up to what she was seeing. For time, Janet called, already prepping the sight on his right arm. Katie stepped forward with the 14-gauge needle already in her hand, her movement smooth and automatic. This was muscle memory. This was 1,000 field procedures compressed into the arc of a wrist, the angle of approach, the way you knew you were in the vein by the subtle give of resistance ending. She'd done this intense under mortar fire. She'd done this on the hood of a Humvee with dust and blood mixing in the heat. She'd done this with hands that were nothing like the steady, careful hands she was using now. The needle slid in. Blood returned in the catheter. She pushed the saline, watching the line flush clear, and her vision tunneled the way it always did in crisis. One patient. One set of vitals. One problem to solve. The rest of the world could wait. Pressure's dropping, Marcus said. 90/58. The man's face was slack, unconscious, and Katie found herself staring at it despite every protocol about professional distance. There was something familiar in the shape of his jaw, the angle of his cheekbones. Something that tugged at a memory she'd spent 7 years trying to bury. Her hands were trembling, not visibly, nobody would see it, but she could feel it in her own nervous system, the small shake that came from adrenaline and recognition and the terrible possibility that the past wasn't as finished as she'd convinced herself it was. Katie, we need his history. Dr. Sterling's voice came from the doorway of the trauma bay. He stood with the particular posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his white coat pristine, his silver-grey hair swept back in a style that looked expensive. He'd been at Mercy General for 12 years, and in those 12 years, he'd built a reputation as a doctor who valued protocol more than people. He ruled the ER like a man guarding his kingdom. Anything the paramedics didn't give us. Nothing, Katie said. Her voice was steady. That was good. Her voice was always steady in crisis. No ID. Paramedics found him unresponsive. He's a Ranger, based on his ring and patch. Army, probably, given the tattoo on his forearm. She'd seen the tattoo when she was inserting the 4, faded ink on sun-damaged skin. A name. Rodriguez. And beneath it, a date. 2006, Tikrit. Dr. Sterling moved into the bay with the kind of deliberation that suggested he was considering everything at once, the patient stability, the resource allocation, the institutional liability. But his eyes, when they found Katie, were calculating something else entirely. She could see it happen, the moment he registered her precision, her efficiency, the way she moved through crisis like she'd been trained for it. She could see him noting the way she'd assessed this patient with a competence that didn't match what his mental file said about her. Just a nurse. Night shift. Invisible. The silence in the trauma bay lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the monitors began their urgent chorus, and the work resumed. Katie's hands were steady now. The trembling had passed. That was what training did for you. It gave you a way to function when your mind was screaming. It gave you a script to follow when everything else was falling apart. What happened next didn't just change the patient's trajectory. It began a sequence of events that would unravel everything Katie had built in her 6 months of careful anonymity, everything she'd constructed to keep herself hidden from the people who might be looking for her. But that wasn't visible yet. Not to Dr. Sterling, standing in the doorway with his eyes narrowing as he watched the night shift nurse work with precision that bordered on impossible. Not to Marcus and Janet, moving through their own tasks without understanding that they were standing next to something they couldn't see. Not to the man on the stretcher, unconscious and bleeding and carrying a name on his arm that connected him to Katie in ways she was only beginning to remember. The ER settled into its controlled chaos, the way it always did when death was negotiable and time was still a resource. And Katie Rodriguez, who had spent 6 months becoming nobody, felt the armor she'd so carefully constructed develop its first hairline crack. The ER settled into its controlled chaos, the way it always did when death was negotiable and time was still a resource. Dr. Sterling waited until Maria arrived in the waiting room, her face streaked with tears and fear, before he made his move. He timed it perfectly. Katie was updating the patient's chart at the bedside when Sterling pushed through the door, his white coat moving like a sail catching wind. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual institutional drone as he positioned himself between Katie and the exit, a deliberate block of territory. "Nurse Rodriguez," he said, loud enough for the charge nurse and 2 residents to hear from the hallway. "Explain to me and to this family why you ordered a comprehensive tox screen and extended blood work panel without attending physician authorization." Maria stepped forward, confused. "Is David?" "Your brother is stable," Katie said quietly, her eyes still on the monitor. "His vitals were fluctuating. I ordered the panel to rule out." "I didn't ask you to diagnose," Sterling cut in, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "I asked you to explain the unauthorized orders. This is exactly the problem with you people who think 6 months gives you clinical judgment. You're a nurse, not a doctor. Stay in your lane." The words landed like shrapnel. Katie felt them in bed, felt the weight of his authority pressing down. 3 residents in the hallway had stopped moving. The sister was staring at Katie now with something like doubt creeping across her face. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, the only sound that mattered, the only one telling the truth. Katie took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained level. His pressure was dropping. His heart rate was elevated. The tox screen confirmed what the vitals suggested. She paused, meeting Sterling's eyes for the first time. A single tear escaped, unexpected, and she wiped it away without breaking his gaze. "I treated him the way every ranger deserves to be treated." Sterling's face reddened like a blood pressure cuff inflating. "That's exactly the excessive emotional involvement I'm documenting. This isn't a battlefield, Florence Nightingale. It's a hospital with protocols. We follow procedure here, not sentiment." He turned and left, but the damage was already done. Maria's hand found Katie's wrist, squeezing gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for fighting for him." Katie nodded once and returned to the chart, her handwriting steady despite the storm building in her chest. That evening, Katie entered the break room at 9:27 p.m., the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly green wash. She'd survived her 12-hour shift on autopilot, moving through trauma rooms and medication passes with the kind of mechanical precision that required no thought. The break room was warm and smelled like old coffee and someone's reheated pad thai. 3 nurses sat at the table, Jennifer from day's shift, Marcus from pediatrics, and Donna, the charge nurse who'd trained Katie on her first night. Katie pulled out a chair. Nobody spoke. She unwrapped a sandwich from the staff refrigerator, sat down, and opened her laptop to check her schedule for next week. For exactly 34 seconds, the only sound was the hum of the vending machine in the corner. Then Jennifer stood. Her chair scraped against the linoleum like a knife on bone. Marcus followed, not making eye contact. Donna waited until both of them had moved toward the door, then she stood too. None of them said a word. They filed out in silence, and the break room door swung shut with a pneumatic hiss. Katie sat alone under the flickering lights. One of them had a dead bulb that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. She ate her sandwich without tasting it. The turkey was dry. The bread was stale. Everything tasted like cardboard and failure and the particular poison of institutional silence. This was how they did it. Not with confrontation. With absence. With chairs scraping back and doors closing and the message delivered in perfect, devastating quiet, "You don't belong here." She finished eating at 10:14 p.m. and threw away the wrapper. The trash can exhaled a whiff of medical waste and someone's lunch that had been rotting since Tuesday. The next morning, Katie arrived for her shift at 6:42 a.m., 15 minutes early the way she always did. The day shift staff was gathered near the unit's public write-up board, the one posted next to the time clock where everyone clocked in and out. Her name was there in red marker, capital letters, permanent as blood. Rodriguez, failure to maintain professional boundaries, unauthorized orders, written warning. Her hand hovered toward the board, but she didn't touch it. The marker ink was still slightly wet. Sterling had done this sometime in the last 12 hours, probably around midnight when the hospital slowed to a crawl and there were fewer witnesses. Except there were always witnesses. Junior residents walked past, whispering. A medical student she'd never seen before asked loudly, "Who's Rodriguez?" and another answered, "That weird night nurse who thinks she's special." Katie turned away from the board and clocked in. The badge reader beeped, a small acknowledgement of her presence that meant nothing. She pulled up the patient roster and found that David, the ranger, the man with her name tattooed on his skin, was listed in Trauma Bay 3. His vital sign scrolled across the screen, stable, holding, no acute changes. Sterling watched from his office window on the second floor, phone already in his hand. He'd spent the last 72 hours making moves, laying groundwork, building the structure that would contain her. He'd called Richard Chen, the hospital president, at 8:51 a.m. on the day after the humiliation scene. His voice had been measured, concerned, professional. "Richard, I have concerns about a nurse with an incomplete employment file. No verifiable references. No prior hospital experience listed. I'm worried about liability." Richard had taken the bait immediately. By noon, Sterling had already contacted Sharon Williamson, the HR director, requesting a full credentials audit. And by 2:51 p.m., Patricia Morgan, an outside compliance investigator with a reputation for finding problems, was reviewing Katie's employee file in Sterling's office. The file was thin, impossibly thin. No previous hospital employment. No military service checked. No references beyond a single name, Miguel Rodriguez, son, age 17, emergency contact. "This is unusual," Patricia had said, spreading the pages across the desk like a card reader interpreting fate. "Most nurses come with 2 or 3 previous positions. Transfer letters. Recommendation forms. She has nothing." Sterling had leaned back in his chair. "She's competent. I'd argue exceptionally competent. But competent without credentials, without history, without anything to verify, that concerns me. What he didn't say, she makes me look inadequate. What he didn't say, she moves like she knows something I don't. What he didn't say, I watched her in that trauma bay and realized she was in command, and I have spent 23 years building a career where no one questions my authority." Katie moved through her shift like a ghost in Scrubs. She hung 4 bags, charted vitals, responded to call lights. During rounds, she checked on David, her David, the one whose name she'd carried across 2 decades like a scar. He was still unconscious, his monitors displaying the steady drumbeat of a heart that was holding on. She noticed the faded tattoo on his forearm more clearly now, Rodriguez, Tikrit 2006. The letters were blurred by time and bandaging, but the meaning was unmistakable. He'd carried her name into hell and somehow brought it back. That night, during her break, Katie returned to her locker and opened the small cardboard box she kept in the back, behind her spare scrubs and the non-slip shoes she rotated through. Inside was a folded American flag, the triangular kind they give to the families of the dead. And underneath it, a photograph, herself, 24 years old, in navy dress whites, her expression the kind of composed confidence that comes from having survived things that don't have names. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez, Naval Special Warfare Command, standing on the deck of a ship that no longer existed in the version of herself she was living now. She closed the box quickly, as if the photograph might escape and demand to be acknowledged. The next morning, at 7:19 a.m., Katie was assisting a post-operative patient with morning vitals when she heard the alarm. Not a gentle alert. A full-code alarm, the kind that pulls the entire trauma team like a magnet pulling iron filings. She was 6 rooms away from David's bed when she heard it. The monitor was screaming. His pressure was crashing. His heart rate spiking to levels that meant something was catastrophically wrong inside his chest. Katie moved before conscious thought. She was at his bedside in 6 seconds flat, and what she saw made her hands move on their own, the kind of automatic response that only comes from training so deep it lives in muscle memory. His breathing was shallow. His skin was gray. The monitor showed a pattern that meant his heart was surrounded by fluid, drowning, suffocating in blood that should have been contained and wasn't. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis crystallized like ice forming on glass. Sterling rounded the corner as she was calling out vitals to the gathering trauma team, her voice steady and precise, BP 70/42 and dropping. HR 147. Respiratory distress. We need a needle. Now. Stand back, nurse, Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. I'm taking this patient. But Katie was already reaching for the equipment tray, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before in places where there was no backup and no option to fail. She positioned herself at the patient's bedside with the needle in hand, and the room went absolutely silent, the kind of silence that comes when everyone in the space suddenly realizes they're watching something they don't quite understand. The monitor went flat. Not gradually. Not with warning. 1 second the cardiac rhythm traced a steady line across the screen, and the next second the entire waveform collapsed into the flatline shriek that every medical professional in the building would recognize in their sleep. The sound hit like a physical force, that high-pitched wail that meant the heart had stopped pumping blood, which meant the brain had maybe 4 minutes before permanent damage began. Dr. Sterling was in the middle of a sentence to the 4 hospital administrators standing near the nursing station, men in tailored suits who had come to observe rounds and assess operational efficiency. He was using the word protocol when the alarm sounded from the trauma bay where Katie's Ranger patient lay sleeping, his body still mending from the injuries that had brought him in 3 days ago. Katie was already moving. She didn't think about hierarchy. She didn't calculate the cost of insubordination. Her hands knew what her civilian training had tried to bury, the muscle memory from field surgeries under mortar fire, from trauma tents where the only difference between life and death was speed and absolute precision. She was at the patient's bedside in 7 seconds, her eyes scanning the monitors, her ears listening to what the body was telling her beneath the chaos of alarms. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins. Blood pressure 70/40 and dropping like a stone. Cardiac tamponade. Blood had accumulated in the pericardial sac around the heart, compressing it, crushing it, squeezing the life out of him 1 milliliter at a time. The patient had maybe 5 minutes before irreversible shock. The heart couldn't fill. The brain couldn't perfuse. The system would collapse. Call a crash team, Katie said, but her voice wasn't asking. It was commanding, the voice of someone who had done this before under circumstances infinitely worse than a Houston hospital room. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his white coat flapping like the wings of some territorial bird. The 4 administrators clustered behind him, their eyes wide, their expensive watches catching the fluorescent light. Sterling's face had already hardened into that expression of institutional ownership, the look of a man whose authority was being questioned in front of witnesses. I'll handle this, Sterling said. Step back, Nurse Rodriguez. Katie didn't step back. She was already moving to the crash cart, already pulling the emergency kit that held what she needed. Her hands had learned in places where hospitals were concepts rather than buildings, where sterilization meant what you could manage with rainwater and prayer, where the only real option was to move faster than death. "He needs immediate pericardiocentesis," Katie said, her voice steady as concrete. "He has less than 5 minutes." The needle goes into the pericardial space at the 5th intercostal, subxiphoid approach. You aspirate the blood accumulation or he codes out. Sterling's voice dropped into ice. "As you can see," he said to the board members, as if Katie hadn't spoken at all, as if the monitor wasn't still screaming, "we occasionally deal with staff who overestimate their clinical judgment. I'll have this patient transferred to the OR for proper procedure." The OR was 4 floors away. Prep time would consume 12 minutes minimum. The patient had 5. Katie calculated this in the space of a heartbeat, the way a soldier calculates whether to move left or right when rounds start coming in. The math was the same. The variables were identical. The only difference was the uniform and the paperwork. She pushed past Sterling. Not violently. Not with aggression. She simply moved through the space he occupied the way a Navy SEAL moves through an objective, with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who has already decided what needs to happen and is simply executing the plan. Sterling grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in, his voice rising. "You are committing assault." His face had turned a deep purple, the color of arterial blood. "I will have your license. I will have you arrested. Someone restrain her." The security guard, Tom Vasquez, a Marine veteran who worked nights and never said much, stepped forward. But instead of reaching for Katie, he positioned himself between her and Sterling, his shoulders squared, his posture the unmistakable stance of someone who understood what was actually happening in this room. Katie's hands were already working. She prepped the patient's chest with betadine, the sharp antiseptic smell cutting through the fierce sweat that filled the room. The 4 board members stood motionless, their phones halfway to their pockets, their corporate instincts paralyzed by the raw reality of medical crisis. Sterling was still screaming about liability, still threatening, still trying to maintain control of a situation that had already moved beyond his reach. The needle was a 14-gauge angiocath, and Katie inserted it with the kind of calm that only comes from having done this in circumstances where calmness was the only difference between a patient going home and a body going to the morgue. She positioned it at the 5th intercostal space, subxiphoid approach, and felt the familiar resistance of tissue, then the give as the needle punctured the pericardial membrane. The syringe drew back. 200 cubic centimeters of blood. The accumulated hemorrhage that was strangling the patient's heart, crushing his lungs, destroying his blood pressure. 200 cc and then the needle was out and the monitor. The monitor spiked. Not back to normal. Not immediately. But the flat line fractured, then reformed, then showed the first fragile traces of sinus rhythm. The blood pressure began climbing. 75. 80. 85. The oxygen saturation rose. The patient's face began to pink slightly as the blood reached his tissues again. The room didn't just go silent. The silence became a presence, became a thickness in the air that made it hard to breathe. Sterling's face had drained from purple to a grey-white that looked like he was about to become a patient himself. The 4 board members stood with their mouths open, their eyes moving from the monitor, now showing a stable rhythm, now showing a heartbeat that had been seconds away from becoming an obituary, to Katie, who was already washing her hands, her movements economical and professional, as if she hadn't just violated 17 layers of hospital protocol to save a man's life. "Get me 2 units of blood," Katie said to the resident standing frozen near the crash cart. "Type and cross already done. And I need a bed in the ICU. Call ahead, tell them we have a post-operative tamponade with successful emergency drainage. Vitals are stabilizing." The resident moved. The rhythm of the hospital reasserted itself. The crisis transitioned to maintenance, to monitoring, to the professional choreography of saving someone from the edge. Sterling's voice was ice when he spoke. "You're done," he said. "Security, escort her out of this unit immediately. Nurse Rodriguez is suspended effective immediately pending investigation." You have violated multiple protocols, exceeded your scope of practice, and assaulted a senior physician. Katie didn't respond. She didn't need to. The board members had seen what they'd come to see, not a nurse who overestimated her competence, but a clinician moving with the precision of someone whose training ran deeper than titles or credentials. They had watched incompetence try to manage a crisis, and they had watched competence simply move past it. Tom Vasquez walked Katie to the door of the unit, his presence solid, protective in the way that only another military person understood. As they reached the hallway, Katie paused and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. The kind of nod that meant he understood exactly what had happened in that room, and exactly who had been right. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was already reaching for his phone, his mind already calculating how to rewrite this narrative, how to preserve his authority, how to turn Katie's competence into insubordination. He was a man who had spent his entire career learning how to weaponize institutional power, and he had just watched that power fail spectacularly in front of the people who controlled his promotion and his reputation. Katie walked toward the parking lot as her suspension papers were being printed. The rain had started again, and it hammered the concrete like applause, the kind of applause that only comes when everyone in the room finally understands the truth about who they've been standing next to all along. Dr. Sterling moved through Mercy General's administrative corridors with the precision of a man who understood that institutional power flowed through certain veins and not others. His phone was already in his hand before he reached the third floor. Richard Chen, the hospital president, answered on the second ring. Sterling had learned years ago that men like Chen kept their lines open for men like him. "Richard, we have a serious situation," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of medical authority. The nurse who performed that unauthorized procedure without proper credentials or oversight, her employment file is sparse. Dangerously sparse. I need you to pull everything. Background check, references, military history she claims not to have. This level of recklessness suggests deliberate deception. Chen's response was careful. Sterling could hear the president's administrative brain calculating liability. Within an hour, a third-party investigator named Patricia Morgan appeared at Mercy General, a compliance specialist with a sharp face and sharper instincts. She moved through the hospital like a woman accustomed to finding problems. Sterling handed her files with the confidence of a man building a case methodically, strategically, with the understanding that paperwork was a weapon that never missed. "Every chart she's touched in the past 6 months," Sterling instructed. "I want inconsistencies. Deviations from protocol. Anything that suggests she's operating outside standard practice." Patricia nodded, already scanning files. "What about the procedure itself?" "Completely unauthorized. No attending supervision. She took control of a patient during a board inspection and performed invasive intervention without consent documentation. And when I questioned her background, she became evasive. Hostile, even. The words were chosen carefully. Each one true enough to survive scrutiny, shaped to create the impression Sterling needed. He was not a man who dealt in outright lies. He was a man who understood that truth could be arranged like furniture, moved, angled, positioned to create precisely the shadow he wanted cast. By evening, Sterling had activated the next layer of his network. He called the hospital's chief HR officer, Sharon Williamson, and requested a formal suspension meeting. Not a conversation. A proceeding. The kind of institutional framework that made it nearly impossible for anyone inside it to protest without sounding unreasonable. Sharon agreed. She always did. The next morning, Katie was summoned to the HR office on the 5th floor. Tom Vasquez, a respiratory tech who'd worked alongside her through 3 night shifts, walked her to the elevator. His jaw was tight. As they rode up, he whispered, "You did the right thing, He didn't meet her eyes. He didn't need to. His voice carried what mattered, the knowledge that she had made a choice that transcended protocol, and that choice had cost her. The HR office smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and the particular staleness of a room with no windows. Sharon Williamson sat behind a desk that had never seen the hand of a patient. Patricia Morgan sat to her right, a folder open, pen poised. Sterling stood by the wall, a positioning choice that Katie recognized immediately. Accusers didn't sit. They remained elevated. Separate. Ms. Rodriguez, Sharon began, we're here to discuss several concerns that have come to our attention regarding your employment history and recent conduct. Katie Saturday. Her hands were steady. This was familiar ground, not the but the institutional choreography of power. She had danced different versions of this dance before, in different uniforms, in different countries. The music was the same. Your employment application indicates a 3-year gap between your previous position and your hire date at Mercy General, Patricia said, consulting her notes. You declined to provide references from any prior military service. When questioned about your background, you became defensive. I wasn't defensive, Katie said. Her voice was level. I was private. Those often look identical from the outside, Patricia replied. We need documentation. Military service records, if applicable. References we can contact. You understand that in light of the unauthorized procedure you performed, we need to establish your credibility. Sterling leaned forward slightly. The movement was calculated, not aggressive, merely interested. I'm also concerned about what appears to be a pattern of concealment. A nurse who won't disclose her background, who performs procedures outside her scope, who resists normal oversight, these are warning signs, Ms. Rodriguez. Frankly, they raise questions about psychological stability. Katie looked at him. For one moment, just long enough for Sterling to see it, something shifted behind her eyes. A recognition. A measurement. He held her gaze and saw, with the clarity of a man who had just made a terrible mistake, that he was looking at a person whose composure was not weakness. It was restraint. There was a difference. A crucial one. But the moment passed. Katie looked away. Do you have military service you haven't disclosed? Sharon asked directly. Katie took one measured breath. I have personal history that doesn't affect my nursing competence. That's not an answer, Patricia said. We need documentation. Or we must suspend you pending investigation. The silence that followed was not negotiable. Katie stood without being asked to stand. Without excuse or explanation, she walked toward the door. Sterling moved to block her path, not physically, just with his presence, but Katie stepped around him as though he was furniture. As though he was nothing at all. She left them in the office, papers unsigned, questions unanswered, suspended from duty effective immediately. That evening, Katie sat in the waiting room of the Houston Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and the fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with the particular hum of institutional indifference. The room was full of shattered young men and women. A corporal with a prosthetic leg below the knee rocked slightly in a chair, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. A female Marine with a chest full of tattoos stared at nothing, her breathing shallow. An older veteran, maybe 60, gripped his phone like it was the only thing tethered him to the earth. Katie filled out intake forms. The questions were familiar. Nightmares? Every night. Flashbacks? Constant. Intrusive thoughts? Yes. She checked every box. Every single one. Her pen didn't hesitate. This was honesty. This was what happened when you stopped hiding and started accounting. A therapist's voice called another name from down the hall. Not Katie's. The waiting continued. Around her, the broken sat in chairs designed for waiting, and Katie understood with absolute clarity that she had arrived at the place she should have come to months ago, years ago, perhaps the moment she stopped being Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez and tried to become someone else entirely. The rain outside the windows began to hammer harder, the kind of rain that came in Houston in late spring, sudden, violent, cleansing. Katie watched it streak the glass and recognized in that water the sound of something washing away. Back at Mercy General, Dr. Sterling entered the security office on the basement level. Jake Morrison, the IT administrator, looked up from his station, a wall of monitors displaying various corridors and trauma bays throughout the hospital. Jake was a Marine. Sterling knew this because Jake wore it the way soldiers wear rank, invisible until it mattered. Squared shoulders. Precise movements. Eyes that had seen things. "I need a favor," Sterling said. His voice was smooth. Reasonable. That footage from the pericardiocentesis procedure. The one from the trauma bay during the board inspection. "I need it isolated onto secure media and removed from the main server. Evidence preservation for the legal case we're building." Jake nodded slowly. "Sure thing, Doctor. I can do that." Sterling left satisfied. He had covered his tracks. The footage would be isolated. Secured. Removed from any system where it could be accessed or recovered. By the time anyone thought to look for it, it would be gone. He had learned long ago that the best way to control a narrative was to control the evidence that contradicted it. What Sterling did not understand was that Jake Morrison had watched 3 Marines bleed out in Helmand Province from decisions made by men exactly like Sterling, men who prioritized institutional protection over the human beings in front of them. What Sterling did not know was that after he left the office, Jake burned the security footage onto 3 separate drives, timestamping each one with blockchain verification that would make tampering impossible to hide. What Sterling did not anticipate was a former Marine IT administrator with access to every system in the hospital uploading the complete, uncut, date and time-stamped footage directly to the Texas Medical Board with a formal whistleblower complaint documenting Sterling's specific request to delete evidence. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. But that wasn't the worst part for Sterling. Not yet. The worst part was that he had no idea what was coming. The worst part was that somewhere in a VA waiting room, a woman with the composure of a predator who had learned to appear harmless was filling out intake forms and checking every box, preparing to tell the truth about exactly who she was and what she had done. The worst part was that her 17-year-old son was at that very moment removing a shadow box from his bedroom closet, the one his mother had made him promise never to open, never to show, never to speak about. The worst part was that Miguel Rodriguez had finally decided that his mother's anonymity was less important than her vindication. The worst part was that Sterling had just started a chain reaction he could never stop. Jake Morrison had worked in Mercy General's IT department for 14 years, and in that time he'd learned that data doesn't lie. The Marine Corps taught him that. Reconnaissance. Verification. Documentation. Never assume. Always verify. So when Dr. Sterling's encrypted email arrived on the security server backup at 11:43 p.m., a message marked urgent that should have been deleted but never was because Sterling didn't know how security protocols actually worked, Jake read the words and felt something cold settle in his chest. Delete all footage from Trauma Bay for the 47-minute window. Pericardiocentesis incident. This is non-negotiable. The email had been sent to a hospital maintenance supervisor, the kind of man who owed Sterling favors from years of looking the other way during various institutional favors. But that supervisor had forwarded it to his union rep, who forwarded it to compliance, and compliance had flagged it in the system logs. Jake pulled up the security footage. Every frame. All 47 minutes. Katie Rodriguez's hands moving with surgical precision under pressure. The monitor climbing. 85. 90. 92. Sterling screaming about liability while a patient's chest cavity filled with blood that shouldn't be there. Sterling's face going white when he realized she was saving a life he'd been prepared to let slip away just to maintain his control. Jake made a copy. Then another. Then a third. He placed them on an encrypted USB drive and walked to the Texas Medical Board office in downtown Houston during his lunch break, a 30-minute drive with the city stretching out gray and humid around him. He didn't call ahead. He didn't announce himself. He walked into the building at 1:17 p.m., found the investigative division, and handed the evidence to a woman named Patricia Morgan whose eyes went wide as she saw the timestamps. He ordered this deletion, she asked. Emails in the metadata, Jake said. 15 minutes after the procedure. He was afraid. Patricia Morgan would spend the next 3 weeks reconstructing Sterling's entire career, finding 8 previous complaints of retaliation against competent staff who'd threatened his authority. 8. All quietly settled. All buried under confidentiality agreements signed in exchange for severance packages and signed acknowledgement that no wrongdoing had occurred. But this time was different. This time there was a video. This time the woman he'd attacked had a Navy Cross and connections that made hospital board members nervous when they got calls from the Pentagon. The phone call came at 4:06 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Hospital President Richard Chen was in his office reviewing budget allocations when his cell phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up, and a voice came through that made every hair on his neck stand up. "This is Captain Webb, Naval Special Warfare Command. We need to discuss Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez and what happened at Mercy General." 30 seconds of conversation. That's all it took. By 5:56 p.m., security had escorted Dr. Sterling from the hospital. By 6:06 p.m., the Texas Medical Board had opened a formal investigation. By 7:22 p.m., Sterling's attorney was negotiating the terms of his voluntary surrender of his medical license rather than face a public hearing that would have destroyed him far more completely. But he didn't surrender quietly. He fought. He called board members. He invoked friendships and old favors. He tried to paint Katie as unstable, as a nurse overstepping her credentials, as a danger to the institution. And each time he made a call, it was logged. Each time he tried to leverage a connection, that connection was no longer there. The board members he'd cultivated over decades suddenly had no interest in returning his calls. The hospital president who'd once been an ally now refused to take meetings. By week 3, Sterling was being asked to resign. By week 6, his license was permanently revoked based on evidence tampering and patient endangerment. The documents were clear. The footage was clear. The intent was clear. Miguel Rodriguez burst through the ER doors at 6:14 p.m. on the evening of his mother's suspension, carrying a shadow box that had been locked in a storage unit in Corpus Christi for nearly 2 decades. He was 17 years old and his hands were shaking, and he walked past 3 nurses without seeing them because his eyes were locked on the nurses' station where his mother stood checking discharge papers with her name freshly added to the write-up board. The shadow box hit the counter with a sound like gunshot, and military decoration scattered across shift reports like fallen promises. A bronze star with Valor. A purple heart. Another purple heart. And there, catching the fluorescent light like it was still wet with blood and salt water, a Navy Cross. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the ventilator down the hall wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Miguel's voice broke. "Mom, they fired you for saving someone. They need to see these. They need to see what you did." Katie stood motionless. Her hand froze over the clipboard. For 6 months she'd hidden. For 6 months she'd worn the invisibility like armor. Now it was shattered across a metal counter in front of 37 people, and her son's eyes were filled with tears, and she couldn't move because if she moved, something inside her would break that she wasn't sure could be reassembled. A Navy SEAL captain named Webb was visiting his teammate 3 doors down, the one recovering from a shattered femur, when he heard the crash. He walked to the nurse's station and saw the medals. He saw the name on the discharge papers. He picked up the Navy Cross with hands that had held the same weight many times before, and he began to speak in a voice that carried like it had been trained to cut through rotor wash. "Bronze star with Valor." He paused. "Silver star." Another pause. The room was listening now. Every head turned. 2 purple hearts. His voice got quieter, which somehow made it louder. "And a Navy Cross. For actions in Tikrit, 2006. Where she carried for Rangers through enemy fire after their convoy was ambushed." He looked up, and his eyes found Dr. Sterling standing 12 feet away near the medication dispensary. "I was one of those Rangers, Doctor. She saved my life. She saved all of our lives." Dr. Sterling's face drained of color. The blood retreated so completely that for a moment he looked like something that had already died and was just learning about it. His mouth opened. His jaw worked without sound. He reached for the counter and his hand fell short. The phone that changed everything rang on Richard Chen's cell at exactly 4:02 p.m. When the Pentagon calls a hospital president, you answer before the first ring finishes. When a captain from Naval Special Warfare Command tells you that you're harboring a known hero under suspension for doing her job, you understand very quickly that your institutional hierarchy has just become irrelevant. By 5:36 p.m., security escorted Sterling from the building. His badge was deactivated. His office was sealed. His hospital privileges terminated not just at Mercy General but flagged nationwide, a mark that would follow him to every institution that cared enough to check. The IT administrator presented the footage to the board while this happened, and the board watched Sterling's face in real time as he understood that his network had abandoned him. His former allies were already issuing statements about how they'd always had concerns about his management style. His mentor from medical school wasn't taking calls. What happened next became a story that got told in hospital break rooms and medical ethics courses. 6 months later, Katie left her shift at Mercy General, now reinstated, now with her reputation secured, now working as ER clinical director instead of hiding in anonymity. She stopped at a grocery store to pick up coffee for the drive home. Outside the entrance, under a sagging blue canopy advertising discount supplemental insurance, sat Dr. Sterling at a folding table. He wore a cheap polo shirt that didn't fit quite right. His medical license hung framed behind him, but the frame held only empty space where the license used to be. His face had aged 10 years in 6 months. His hands trembled as he shuffled pamphlets. Katie walked past him. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Sterling's mouth opened like he wanted to say something, an apology, an explanation, a plea for recognition of who he used to be. But no words came. Katie continued into the store without breaking stride, her back to him, her composure intact. He watched her go. He would spend the rest of his career in this position, selling insurance at a folding table, his cautionary tale taught in medical ethics courses across the country. The Sterling case. Institutional authority versus clinical competence. The cost of retaliation. His name became synonymous with the precise moment when a career ended not in a dramatic downfall but in the quiet recognition that he had chosen the wrong person to destroy. Jake Morrison was promoted to Security Systems Director. The commendation from the Texas Medical Board was framed in his office, and every time he looked at it, he thought about what the Marine Corps had taught him about verification. Never assume. Always verify. Guard the truth even when telling it costs you something. For days after emergency surgery, David Garcia woke up. For 2 hours he existed in that liminal space where consciousness is a question you're still asking, where the machines around you are more real than your own body. Then his sister Maria was there, crying and holding his hand, and she was saying something about the nurse, about a name on the tattoo, about impossible coincidences. She's the one from Tikrit. The medic. The one who pulled you out when everyone else was pinned. Katie Rodriguez avoided his room for 6 hours. She told herself it was because he was still in recovery, because extra visits weren't clinically necessary, because maintaining professional distance was important. But what she was really afraid of was that she'd look at him and see a ghost, the young Army Ranger she'd carried through the killing zone in Tikrit, all those years ago when she was still someone else, still wearing a uniform that meant something, still believing that heroism came with decorations instead of hiding in ER break rooms. Maria found her at the nurse's station at 8:53 p.m. He's asking for you. He knows something. I don't know how, but he knows. Katie walked to room 412 with her composure wrapped around her like armor. She opened the door. David was propped up in bed, weak and pale but alive, his eyes tracking her face as she entered. She saw his eyes drop to her name badge. Rodriguez, RN. She watched understanding dawn across his face, confused at first, then urgent. He adjusted the bandage on his forearm and revealed it, the tattoo that had been there for 18 years, faded but unmistakable, Rodriguez, Tikrit 2006. I got this in Germany. His voice came like a whisper. After the firefight. They told me a Navy medic carried me out. I never remembered the face. The trauma. I only remember the name they kept saying. Rodriguez. I've carried that name every day of my life. His eyes filled with tears. I got this tattoo to remember someone real. Someone who was real. You were real too, Katie said quietly. You are real. She reached into her pocket, the pocket where she'd carried it since his arrival, where she'd cleaned and polished it each night in her apartment, and withdrew the Army Ranger ring. She slipped it back onto his finger, and David gripped her hand with surprising strength. You saved me twice, he whispered. You saved me first, Katie said. Twice. Once in Tikrit. And once by reminding me who I was. The ER doors opened at 9:15 p.m., and the ambulance bay lights cut through the Houston night. Katie stood ready, composure intact, ready for the next patient, the next crisis, the next moment where her hands would remember what her mind had tried to forget. She didn't need a uniform anymore. She didn't need a rank or a medal or a name on a shadow box. She had already become what she was always meant to be. If you found Katie's story moving, please subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And in the comments, tell us, what did you think should have happened to Dr. Sterling? Was justice enough? Let's talk about the quiet heroes among us.